So that's me, Nigel Kersten on Twitter. I'm Nigel at Puppet Labs. I joined early enough. Well, actually, there's still only one Nigel. I think we might have a contract against anyone else being hired with the same name. So we always like to kick things off with a few polls. So I do have a pretty limited selection of prizes, which are these t-shirts some of you might have had before. And I only have 3 sizes. So if you get the right answer and you're the right size, you can get a t-shirt. First, who only started using Puppet in the last month? Cool. We love having new people here. This is a really, really great thing for us. Last 3 months? Last year? Okay. Who's been using Puppet more than 2 years? Wow. This is going to be a really cool crowd. I'm going to skip over a lot of the stuff about how Puppet works then, for a lot of you. Who started using Puppet before 2.6? Okay. Who started using it before 0.25? I'm sorry, it's much better these days. Who's before 2.4? Did anyone start using it before 0.22? Okay, who was the oldest person here? You might already have a t-shirt. Actually, who's the newest? Who's a medium and started using Puppet in the last month? Let me pick up the medium. Large. Extra large? Make sure I get the right one. Who would just like a large t-shirt? I should just make you all fight for it. I think you were first. Cool. Okay, who identifies as a sysadmin or an operations person? Okay, developer? Who was really confused about whether they were a sysadmin or a developer? Who's a manager in the crowd? Come on. I'm not ashamed. Be proud. Managing people is awesome. Who's using Puppet in conjunction with another automation tool? Like, okay, cool. Who's not doing any automation at all yet? You don't have to be ashamed. This is what we're here for. Cool, this is awesome. So, you know, we don't want to get too self-pitying as sysadmins, but being a sysadmin kind of sucks sometimes. You know, who thinks the rest of the company doesn't actually understand what you do? It's kind of a problem. And I actually think this is one of the best things about DevOps and the whole sort of DevOps movement, that we're starting to actually socialize amongst the rest of the company what it is we do. The rest of the company is starting to understand what it's like being a sysadmin. So the's been some pretty interesting studies done. On average, most sysadmins are interrupted every 15 minutes during a working day. And I don't know if that feels plausible to you, but it certainly reminds me of what sort of being a sysadmin was like. The trouble with this is, it takes you about 30 minutes to regain context after you're interrupted. So you're working for 14 minutes, someone interrupts you, it's another half hour before you're back where you were. And this is, I think, one of the great things about having a really good automation system. It reduces the frequency of interruptions, it starts to introduce workflows and change management practices, and all of these things really help as far as that frequent interruption. And I actually think that's the thing that's the most dispiriting about being an operations person. It's not just the interruption, it's the kind of interruption. It's down, fix it now. It's not that much fun, really. So we're under this continuous pressure to do more and more and more. And I think we've seen with the rise of software as a service that users have a different expectation now. They expect using your tools internally to be as easy as going to GitHub, clicking sign up, and creating a repository. And I think software as a service really has changed expectations, and it means that we're forced to produce much more self-service infrastructure, and infrastructure that's much more responsive to the business needs. And this is good, because the more we do to service what the business is actually trying to do, the more people are going to value what we do, and the more fun work's going to be, and actually the nicer people are going to be when they still inevitably interrupt you. There's no world in which we're going to have fewer servers. You know, one of my favorite pithy statements I hear around is, you know, the cloud, it's still someone else's server. It's not something magical. Those of you who are running private cloud, public cloud, all of this stuff, it's still a server. Something's still got to manage it. And I think one of the things that really caused me to love Puppet when I first adopted it was Puppet really doesn't care where you run it. You can run Puppet on a bare metal OS install, you can run infrastructure as a service, private virtualization, inside a container, all of these things. Puppet just still works. It works out where it is and it works out how to get there. I think what we're seeing too is sort of the return of a bunch of changes that happened in the 90s and the 2000s. I don't know if any of you lived through companies where you started outsourcing things. Companies went, you know what, IT, we don't really need to do that. It's the same as everyone else. So we're going to start outsourcing these things. And we've seen a lot of companies get really hurt by this and sort of recover as they bring everything back in-house. And they realize that even though a lot of what you do in IT is the same as everyone else, which is why Puppet modules and all these sort of pre-packaged practices are so good, you need that inside the company. You need someone who actually understands what the business is trying to do in order to deliver what IT is doing. Software's eating the world, and it really is a competitive advantage, being good at managing software and managing infrastructure. It's not really just about the technology though. You know, we've got more and more pressure. It's about delivering more, it's about delivering it more quickly, and it's about responding more quickly. One of the things that I think a lot of people get really frustrated by when they don't have automation is how long it takes them to roll out a new application. You know, we talk to large customers before they've started using Puppet Enterprise, and they will spend maybe 6 months after an application's finished internally before it's actually deployed to end users. By that time, the whole world's kind of shifted. And when you find those bugs, you send it back to the development team, and this horrible long feedback cycle happens. The cloud. I was hoping, we originally had this, I think, as the little Simpsons guy man shakes fist at cloud. Cloud's a horribly overused and abused term. I think we've all seen products that describe themselves as cloudy. And the problem there, I think, is that there's actually something different about the cloud. It's about, elastic capacity. It's about agility. It's about self-service. It's about people being able to sign in and do work themselves. It's about not having to sort of feel quite so constrained by your infrastructure. And I think we're seeing people are doing outsourcing sensibly these days. How many of you are still running mail servers internally? Wow. So, even 5-10 years ago, that would have been a radically different result from you all. But I hate running mail servers. It was one of my least favorite things. I think DNS and email are probably the services I dislike running the most. What cloud is letting us do though, is it's democratizing IT. It means that if you're wanting to get started, you can really cheaply do experiments. It means if you're responding to sudden changes in scale, you can respond pretty quickly. And I don't think it's always the right answer. I'm actually doing a talk at the OSDC conference next week in Berlin in defense of data centers. I'm actually still a really big believer in data centers. I think there are a whole bunch of people, when you're in a certain situation, where it makes sense to run your own hardware. There's all sorts of really good privacy reasons, there's all sorts of cost reasons. It can be really easy to just keep paying that huge check to cloud providers each month. But I think if you're sensible about it, you can make use of cloud and really get the best of both worlds. So, how many of you are currently experimenting or in production with containers? How many of you are worried you should be looking at containers? How many of you looked at containers and decided you don't want anything to do with it? That's kind of interesting. So I think containers are kind of this inevitable evolution of this philosophy of immutable infrastructure in general. And it's a pretty good way to run a bunch of different kinds of services, particularly if you've moved to a service-oriented architecture, you're running microservices. There's a certain philosophy around, I don't change boxes once they're in production. Like we've had big clients doing this on bare metal for a long time. They consider all of the machines disposable. And there's all these benefits to working that way. What it means is that you need a really rigorous system at build time, not necessarily at run time. So normally, those of you who are using Puppet, you're running it in production, and Puppet's doing configuration drift and remediation. But if you've absorbed that whole philosophy of immutable infrastructure, and you're running containers, you're running read-only VMs with storage somewhere else, and everything's really ephemeral, and you can throw it away at any time if something goes wrong and just stick out another one, scaling becomes really easy. There's all these really great benefits to doing it, whether you're doing it with containers, virtualization, or bare metal. But what it doesn't get rid of the need for is a robust audit trail around your configuration. You just need it at build time, not at runtime. How many people are currently using images, like golden images, for provisioning their machines? How many people, the image is the source of truth, as opposed to a config management system? Okay, so that's not awesome. Images are great. Images, whether they be containers, VMs, whatever, they're fast, they're a single binary artifact, you can just throw them out there. You've just got to copy them around, and that's really all you have to do. But they're an awesome side effect of your configuration management. They're not the best place for a source of truth. There was one job I turned up to, and on my first day, I met the whole team, and we're sitting in the room, and I got up to move, and I knocked this laptop onto the ground. This is actually a true story. Everyone in the room freaked out and went to run to the laptop. I was like, what the hell's this? And they're like, that's the master laptop. That's what 10,000 machines are all being imaged from. You know, we protect it with our life. Every time we make a change, we make a change to the laptop. I was like, well, how do we actually know what was changed? And they're like, oh, we have no idea. And this sucks. You know, you don't want to always have to go through an upgrade process on that master golden image. You want to be able to describe what's different. You don't want an auditor to turn up and go, so exactly how do your machines differ from vanilla rel? And you're like, well, I don't know, we just have this image thing, and if you want to have a look at it, you can look at it. It's not really the best answer in the world. So I think what we're seeing is that config management is useful both at runtime for one kind of environment, and it's really useful at build time as well. How many of you filled out the DevOps survey this year? How many of you didn't know that we run a DevOps survey every year? That leaves an awful lot of just lazy people, or you thought it was a bad idea. DevOps is another one of these buzzwords like cloud, and I think, you know, it would be premature to converge on a single definition for it now, but I think what we are seeing is that DevOps is a really good tribal signifier for operations people who are looking for a different way of working. They don't want to work in a particularly manual way. They don't want to go through that whole sort of really painful users reporting errors, and then they go and fix it in production, and then something else breaks and they change it. They want to have a much more automated system. They want to take the lessons of software engineering and apply them to operations. And so I think in some ways the name DevOps itself is a little bit misleading. I mean, it's certainly about improving relationships between development teams and operations, but for me it's just as much about taking what the development world has learned over the last 20 or 30 years and making sure we can apply that to our infrastructure. And you'll hear us use the phrase infrastructure as code a whole bunch of times. And that, I think, is the same kind of philosophy. We want to treat our infrastructure like software. We use version control, we create artifacts, we want to be able to roll back, we want to tag releases, we want to be able to take advantage of all of these workflows that the rest of the software engineering world has had. And quite frankly, I think that operations has kind of lagged behind. So this is kind of what we do. We consider that what our mission is to really reduce the cost of change. Change is inevitable. You're always going to have to respond to change. When you finish a project, when you push out a new deployment, it's never static. At some point you're going to have to fix it, you're going to have to improve it, you're going to have to add features to it. And our job is to sit here with all of our projects and products and trying to make it easier and easier for people to create change, test change, deploy change, and roll back change. So I'm going to skip through a bunch of these things. Who was it, again, who hadn't really used Puppet before? Okay, we can do one-on-one sessions with you, and you should definitely come and talk to Nicholas and see his demo, that we're going to be going through Puppet Enterprise and what's going on there. But essentially what we think of ourselves as, we make things run faster, we make you more productive, you don't repeat yourself. You don't write those scripts and then create 20 different variations of it before you roll it out. You want to be able to take advantage of best practices other people have done. I think this has been one of the horrible things for operations before automation solutions came around, was that if one shop came up with a really great way of running PostgreSQL, another shop would end up reinventing the wheel all of the time. And that's kind of boring, and it's kind of horrible. It's bad for vendors. If vendors can rely on more easily standardized infrastructure, that's really great for them, and then you can take advantage of their software. So this is what we do. We don't just work at the file level. A lot of the early primitive config management systems either just managed config files or entries in config files. I think one of the things I really like about Puppet is that the semantics are much closer to your actual intent. What is it you want to do? I want to create a user on this box. And so in the Puppet DSL, you create a user. You're not sitting there saying, well, first I'll make a home directory, and then I'll fiddle around with etc password, and then I've got to work out whether it's a shadow entry or not, and what the hashing method is on this operating system. You just say, I want this user with this password hash. We do this on all sorts of things. I think one of the most exciting things in the last few years has been that these abstractions have gotten higher and higher. And you'll see that when I go through some of the later slides, we're actually getting to the point where we're also demonstrating whole Amazon instances being managed in Puppet. And we're going to be going to a world where we step beyond even just single nodes, where in Puppet we're going to be able to define applications, the front-end load balancer, the middleware, the database layer. You'll be able to define all of those things as a single entity. So how's it we work? We declare what we're doing. Rather than saying how you want to get there, you say the state that you want to get there. You define the state that you want the system to be in, and then we test the system. This is also one of my favorite things about Puppet. We have a no-op mode. Who didn't know that we have a simulation no-op mode? Okay. Who isn't using it but knows about it? This is awesome. So a few years ago, we were finding that a lot of people didn't really even know about no-op mode in Puppet. And one of the things I really like about it is you can go, this is what I intended to happen, is that what's going to happen? And then you get a certain degree of confidence when you actually roll out the change that that's what's going to happen. So then you can go and enforce that change. This is where I think there's actually a really blurry line between compliance and configuration management. If your config management describes the state something should be in, and it's continuously remediating that and making sure the current state's the desired state, that is compliance. And for me, that's a hell of a lot better than sitting there going through a whole bunch of internal documentation saying servers must be configured in this way, and then someone going to a keyboard and making sure they're following those steps. And then finally, we get really great reporting. And in Puppet Enterprise particularly, there's a really great GUI that gives you really easy insight into how much of your infrastructure's applying the changes that you intended in the way you expected. I'm going to skim through this really quickly. Who's seen the SSH demo before? Come on, I think you're all just half asleep. We define multiple resources, we can create relationships between them. This is also a really awesome thing about Puppet. You can sit there and you can say, when I push out a change to that config file, not only does it require the package, because it makes no sense to try and edit the config file before the package lays down the directory structure, but the service can subscribe to it. And so that means when the file changes, the service automatically restarts. For me, this was always one of the most problematic and really frustrating things to troubleshoot. When you've got all the right config files out there in production, but some of the services haven't been restarted and haven't necessarily picked it up. That's just really frustrating to debug. So with Puppet, you model your infrastructure. You're not just pushing out configuration, you're creating a declarative state model that says, when this thing changes, this action should happen. Who's using Puppet on Windows? Who works in a team that manages Windows and you're not using Puppet? Okay, so we were initially caught by surprise, I think, when we first did Puppet on Windows 4 years ago. We expected it to be largely minority people who had 90% Linux infrastructure, 10% Windows, and they just wanted to use the same tool across both. But we're increasingly seeing more and more people adopting Puppet just for Windows. And it's been really interesting seeing Microsoft come out with their new DSC configuration system that, honestly, if you look at it, looks very, very much like Puppet. And so it's been really great working with Microsoft on this, so that as we produce Puppet content, we can take advantage of the stuff they're doing on Windows. Because it's always going to be important to have a heterogeneous solution that crosses platforms. But I think Microsoft have really realized that the state of Windows automation really was falling pretty far behind Linux in terms of really simple text-based descriptions. You could check through config management, you could run into version control, and you could work like a software developer, not just clicking through GUIs to manage systems. If you haven't looked at the Windows stuff recently, you should definitely check out the Forge and search for Windows. There's a whole bunch of really great stuff around SQL Server, managing registry entries, and stuff like this, where we can automatically have packages install and reboot, because Windows has slightly different philosophy around installation and reboots to Linux. I think I only got one snigger for that joke. Okay, how does Puppet work? We create facts. You can hear some of this terminology in, so I'm going to go through it really quickly. Nodes collect facts about themselves, their IP address, where they are, whether they're running on vSphere, KVM, whether they're a Windows box, whether they're a Mac, whether they're Ubuntu. They report that to the server, who takes the Puppet code and compiles it into a catalog, which is just a pure state description of the desired state. Then the node applies that state and reports back to the server on the differences. And I think one of the important things here is you get a really good signal-noise ratio, because only the things that actually changed are usually visible in your reports. You still get all of this info about stuff that's automatically in compliance, but when you're pushing out a change, it's much easier than scanning through 1,000 log messages to work out what was actually different, to just go, those 2 resources I pushed out, those changes actually happened. Who's using Puppet DB? If you're using Puppet Enterprise, you're getting Puppet DB automatically, so you should also stick up your hand. Okay. Puppet DB is really awesome. We started that about 3 years ago, and it's a centralized high-performance store of information about your Puppet infrastructure, all of those facts, the catalogs, the reports that we're talking about, and it's a really high-performance closure system running on the JVM using PostgreSQL. If you install Puppet Enterprise, all of that's automatically there for you, and that's the foundation for almost all of the reporting that we're doing. The thing I like most, I think, about Puppet DB is it has a really good API. It wasn't always easy to retrieve this information from Puppet. You'd have to do a whole bunch of scripting around the server state. But now with Puppet DB, there's a really good REST API to just go, I would like to know what the facts about this node are. I would like to retrieve the catalog that this node got. That sort of stuff can be really, really powerful for completing the automation solution across your company. Who's using the Puppet server? This is the new one running on the JVM. Okay, you should totally do this. If you're using Puppet Enterprise, you've already got it. I would also suggest going and having a look on the Puppet Labs site. Chris Price, the main author of the Puppet server, did a really, really great talk at PuppetConf this year about it. So Ruby's been really great for us. We really love Ruby. It's a really good, simple extension language for Puppet, and it got us an awfully long way. But we started to find out that for high-performance data concurrency, it really wasn't the best thing. Particularly threading was not really where we wanted it to be, but at the same time, we didn't want to rewrite everything we'd done. So we moved to the JVM, the Java Virtual Machine, but we're not rewriting everything in Java. We like closure an awful lot, so we started picking those bits of Puppet on the server side, where performance really wasn't where we wanted it to be, and started rewriting them in closure, and we can still run JRuby underneath. So it's a highly compatible version of the Puppet master, but under load, it's way, way more predictable, which is, I think, one of the slightly frustrating things about the older Puppet server, and it's just much, much more performant. If you have a look at Chris's talk, there's a whole bunch of people that we're seeing who are getting 1, maybe 2 orders of magnitude improvement, depending on the size of your catalogs and the load your systems are under. One of the really nice things we have about the Puppet server too is that there's some really nice metrics in there available. Anyone using Razor? Cool. So Razor's our provisioning system, and one of the things we really like about it is that there's no longer this schism between provisioning and configuration management. Razor has access to all of the information about Puppet and passes that through when the configuration management run happens. There's no more of this sort of sticking information somewhere and then having your kickstart script or whatever on Pixie pull it down and bake it into your image. You can actually have your provisioning and understand what its state is and then pass that through to your config management system. How many mCollective users? Cool. So if you haven't looked at mCollective, that's the thing we use for the orchestration engine in Puppet Enterprise. So all of that stuff there is being powered by mCollective, and it really gives you parallel real-time task execution. And the nice thing is that you get to filter based on facts. So you see this sort of theme growing here, that we're trying to make the ecosystem more and more consistent and taking all of this information that Puppet has to generate in terms of working out how to do stuff and making it available to all of the rest of the projects. If you're not using Hira or Hira, there seems to be no really awesome consensus on how to pronounce it. It's a really great way to separate code from data. So if you look at those Puppet manifests we had, it lets you separate the data that comes into those models of your infrastructure. And I really like this because as far as change management and change workflows that you're going to see another talk by Julian today on, it lets you tell what kind of a change it is. Something that just changes the input data for the model of your infrastructure is a very different kind of change to one that actually changes the model itself. And I find that once you've started splitting out your code and your data, you get much, much tighter feedback loops because people can review changes with much more confidence. Do we have any R10K users in the house? Excellent. I love R10K because it was written by one of the sysadmins at Puppet Labs who was really frustrated with trying to solve this problem. And we've gotten it all the way through now where it's part of the code management product inside Puppet Enterprise itself. So it's another one of our open source projects. It essentially lets you say, it is this exact collection of Puppet code that I want to match this environment on a Puppet server. And I think it's an incredibly useful project, particularly if you're starting to use a lot of modules from the Forge. And did you all know, who didn't know that Puppet 4 came out this week? It makes me feel old. It's a really high version number, it feels like. Puppet 4 is probably the biggest language change we've made to Puppet probably since forever. I think Puppet's grown organically. It's been a really successful open source project with lots of input from all sorts of people. But we really took a step back and sort of formalized the language. We rewrote all of the parser, which has been available as the future parser for the last year or two. If you're running Puppet 3, you could get an advanced preview of what these features were like. But there's a whole bunch of really, really awesome things. It's much more predictable. No longer is everything a string inside the Puppet language. You have actual data types. Let's go through what some of the things are. We have actual data types, we've rewritten the parser, it's much cleaner. I think we've actually removed 60,000 lines of code of old features. And I think it's important to make sure that you're removing as much code as you're adding, particularly on a project that's as alive as this one. We've also moved to an all-in-one agent. So rather than just relying upon dependencies from the operating system, we're now shipping all of that with Puppet. We just found that the list of dependencies we were getting to was really becoming pretty unmanageable, and particularly with all of the different Ruby versions, OpenSSL versions, all of these different components that we rely on, it was becoming really, really difficult to keep managing that. So it means we've got a much more streamlined experience now. You don't have to worry so much about satisfying all the requirements before you install Puppet. When you install the agent, it's going to automatically come with everything that it needs. The other nice thing is that this insulates your config management system from the rest of your operating system. And that's actually quite good. The thing that's managing the rest of the OS, it's good to keep it self-contained and self-reliant so that it can actually manage everything else. So let's go through some of the language enhancements pretty quickly. We now have optional types, and I really want to stress optional here. We don't want to make the Puppet language any more complicated than it has to be. But we're finding that as we become more sophisticated, our user base, it's more and more important to be able to go, what kind of an object is this? This is an array of strings. This means you can create unit tests more easily. You can test the Puppet changes that are actually happening. You can say, you know what? This expects an array. And it's much, much better for your code, your Puppet code, to fail at catalog compile time than it is when you're trying to fail at catalog apply time. Much better to just fail once on the Puppet master and not touch the node than to fail perhaps halfway through an operation. We can now do iteration inside the DSL. And again, this isn't something everyone has to do. I didn't even start having to worry about iteration, I think, for about 6 months after I started using Puppet. But previously, you had to actually go Ruby and go through and learn another whole programming language just to do iteration. So we've introduced some pretty simple expressions here that should be familiar for anyone who's written any Python, Perl, Ruby. These are pretty familiar operators. But it's really nice now that we can actually do this inside Puppet itself. We have Puppet Enterprise, which for us is very much about, it's not about providing something in competition to the open source project, it's about building on top of it. We really, really want to keep our community as one large consistent whole, everyone running from pure open source projects through to our commercial offerings. So the first step for the Puppet 4 agent being all in one is really trying to make sure that no longer do you have Puppet Enterprise or Puppet installed on a machine. Puppet Enterprise has a bunch of additional capabilities, some of which are open source, some of which are commercial, on top of the same open source layer. So with Puppet 4, we unified the file system, because we're starting to find it a little bit frustrating that we might have a Puppet Enterprise customer or a Puppet customer write code that relies upon where Puppet lives on the file system, and then have that be a schism that one part of our community couldn't use code from the other side of our community. So unifying the file system layout, making things much more consistent, this was a really big deal for us. I'm going to go through some of the components here. We're changing Puppet Enterprise slightly over the next year or two. We're starting to break it up into applications. And so anyone who's a Puppet Enterprise customer now automatically gets a license to those apps. And the first Puppet app is the node management app. This, if you've used iTunes Smart Playlists, that was sort of the philosophy behind this. Rather than having to manually classify all of your nodes and work out which workload goes where, let's instead look at the attributes of that node and make something much more dynamic, and sort of bring the modeling up to the classification level as well as inside the code level. Who's using Docker or Amazon with Puppet at the moment? Who didn't know we had really good Docker and Amazon modules on the Forge? Cool. Well, I highly suggest going and look at those. We have some really great people at Side Puppet Labs working on these. These, as we'll go through, let you actually treat like a whole container, just like another resource. And I think this is the rising tide of abstraction that we're seeing more and more with Puppet. We're not just managing files, we're not just managing users, we're not just managing groups, but we can manage whole containers as well. And the same thing goes for Amazon. We can manage attributes, load balancers, security groups, all of these sorts of things. And additionally, recently we've added a whole bunch of unit tests for Amazon. And this is something I really like. Being able to actually unit test your cloud configuration is a really awesome thing. The code manager, this is the stuff built on R10K. This lets us manage infrastructure more reliably across all of the environments. Who is using dynamic environments in Puppet? Excellent. This was another frustration I think with Puppet. You had to manually construct environments and it was difficult to do programmatically. Now it's much, much easier. You just drop a directory into the directory for environments on your master, and that's a new environment. And an environment in Puppet is just a way of segmenting part of your infrastructure. It could be dev, test, prod, or it could be, you could be dividing things up so that perhaps your workstations have a completely different environment to your production service. And we have a whole bunch of really great role-based access control in Puppet Enterprise. You're going to see, this is the sort of philosophy we're trying to take. Most of our innovation in the open source space is going to happen around the agent. But we're making it very compatible with Puppet Server. But the stuff that we're tending to sell on Puppet Enterprise and the commercial offerings are those things that businesses really need and that most people don't usually want to reinvent for themselves. Tie into your Active Directory deployment, be able to create access groups for different parts of your infrastructure. These are the sort of things that you get if you have a look at Puppet Enterprise. This is another really nice feature we've got in Enterprise. There's an endpoint that you can automatically wire up JMX or Graphite to, and you automatically get all of these metrics about the internal runnings of the Puppet server. We have way more slides than I expected, and I'm going to give you guys some questions. Really nice event inspection. This is the general philosophy again. Puppet Enterprise gives you much more insight onto the server side as far as things are going. We're still trying to make sure that the server is very compatible with the rest of our ecosystem, but we're also building things on top of this. And this is the other goal with pulling things apart and making them Puppet apps and making them separate, so that we have a much more loosely coupled system. I think Puppet in general was far too monolithic for our liking, and so you're seeing us start to pull these things apart and make them so that you don't need to absorb the whole system if you just want to consume part of it. And all of the open source modules that are on the Forge, you can contribute to on GitHub or whatever. If you're an enterprise, you'll also get support for those, just like for enterprise itself. Wow, that was a really weird slide. Okay, if you'd read, who hasn't read the 2014 DevOps report? It's not really boring at all. It's actually really interesting if you're trying to affect change in your organization to show this to perhaps some skeptical managers who don't really believe in it. There's some really great metrics there. People who adopt automation, people who adopt config management, people who adopt tools like Puppet perform much more highly, they push out their applications much faster, and they can respond to change much faster. And it may not be the sort of language you always talk to each other as sysadmins with, but it does tend to be the sort of thing that really builds a case with your managers. And these are some of our great customers on Enterprise. Who didn't know about the Puppet Learning VM? Okay, so even if you're running Puppet now, feel free to go have a look at puppetlabs.com/learn. We have the Learning VM you can download, takes you through a bunch of tutorials. as we produce more new features, a lot of the time this is a much easier way to see those new features in action. And even rather than just reading a book, you get to really viscerally, interact with the system and take advantage of the new feature. So even if you're feeling like you're an experienced Puppet user, it's worth checking in there pretty regularly because there's a lot of really new and really awesome content. Who's uploaded a module to the Forge? Excellent, excellent. So the Forge is really important for us because I think one of the key philosophies around the whole DevOps movement has been sharing. And the Forge makes it really easy for you to go, here's a great best practice I've put together. I might be a world expert in creating PostgreSQL configs or dealing with WebSphere or whatever. And you can upload that to the Forge and then other people can take advantage of it. Or maybe you're only doing 20% of the automation that you'd like to do and you're pretty sure you don't have time to do all of it. Upload the module, you can get a community going around your particular module and you'll get contributions to it. And you'll share your content with the rest of the community and you'll end up getting additions. You'll get bug fixes as someone upgrades to an OS version before you do. It can be really, really rewarding uploading modules to the Forge. Training and certification. Amy, who was here before, you should come and chat to her. So depending on what country you're in, who you get sent to talk to. But we offer a whole bunch of great training courses. Internally we do public training and we'll do training inside companies as well. And then once you've gone through the training, you can go through and get your Puppet certification if you want to. Those of you who were using Puppet a long time ago, the documentation was pretty atrocious. I think primarily because it was written by sysadmins and developers. And I used to manage the tech docs team at Puppet Labs, so I have some interest here, but I think technical writers are like one of the most important people any software company can hire. I'm really proud of our documentation, particularly if you go look at the Puppet 4 release notes that are there. They're really, really useful. It's not marketing material, it's like designed to actually help end users. So docs.Puppet Labs, we have worked so much on the documentation over the last couple of years. So if you didn't go look at it all that often, I really encourage you, have another look at the documentation because it's really, really rewarding. And I'm amazed at the pace they're getting things through. Is anyone a Puppet test pilot? Who didn't know about Puppet test pilots? Wow. Okay. puppetlabs.com/PTP. Test pilots is part of our user experience team. We like to test features before we actually write them. So we'll put together prototypes. If you want to have input onto the direction of Puppet and where things are going, mailing lists and IRC and ask.puppetlabs, these aren't always the best ways to give that sort of input. Actually working out how users respond to features is about the most valuable thing for us and for the rest of you as the Puppet community. So if you want to get into that and help influence the actual direction of Puppet in ways other than just contributing code, because it's not just about open source projects contributing code. All sorts of things are really, really important. So if you want to try out new features before they're actually available, or even while we're just discussing them theoretically in the mailing list, we did a lot of this with the future parser. A lot of the stuff we did of trying to solve problems that people were having with Puppet was stuff that we actually ran through with the test pilot people for a year or so before we actually ended up releasing it. Who hangs out on the IRC channel? Excellent. We have a huge IRC channel. I'm amazed. We're well over 1,000 people, I think, at this point. And you'd think that would be completely unmanageable, but it's only somewhat unmanageable. The mailing lists are really awesome. We have Puppet Dev and Puppet User mailing list for the two main different purposes. We've got a few other things around Windows and OpenStack and other projects. And we've got ask.puppetlabs, which is a Stack Exchange like Q&A site for those of you who really don't like email and prefer that sort of Q&A forum style interaction. One thing I wanted to say too is the documentation itself is all open source. So that's an easy way to contribute. Even if you're not a sophisticated programmer and you don't feel competent in contributing to the code base itself, send us pull requests on GitHub for the docs. Even if there's small errors, suggestions, all sorts of things. We love documentation contributions. It's just as, if not more important than code. And we're a company, we're hiring lots of people. I'm hiring a sysops manager at the moment in Portland, but if you have a look, we're hiring people all over the world at the moment. puppetlabs.com/jobs. Who's going to PuppetConf? I just did that flight. No, it sucked. Yeah, there's no good answer. Come to Portland. We're doing PuppetConf this year. We've moved from San Francisco back to Portland. It's way cheaper. The hotels are way cheaper. The food is way better. The beer and coffee is so much better. I often joke Portland is the most European city I've come across in America. Everyone rides bicycles. It's much, much nicer. Very few cars. It's going to be awesome. PuppetConf in Portland this year, we're all really, really excited. That's where Puppet Lab's headquarters is, if you didn't know. So it's really, really nice for PuppetConf to sort of come home for us. It's in October in Oregon, and you can come and chat to any of us about PuppetConf. Also, the call for papers is open at the moment, so that's an easy way to convince your boss to fund the trip, is if you end up getting free attendance to come along to PuppetConf. Any questions? I don't quite know how we're doing this. Do you have a mic, Cara? Or... It's a small, intimate crowd. I'll just repeat questions if anyone has any. They don't just have to be for me. They could be for other people.
Don't be shy.
Sure.
Why are you choosing Java for the version before?
So the question was, why are we choosing Java for the Puppet server? That would be, we're not choosing Java. I'm not fond of Java. We're running on the Java virtual machine, and I think it's really important there's a distinction there. Java the language is Java the language. Clojure is a much more modern language. It's in that sort of family, Scala, Erlang, all of those much more modern functional languages. And we found functional languages are really, really great for high data concurrency. The great thing about the JVM is, I'm sure lots of you are in companies where you're running lots of Java enterprise applications. Because there's been all these people who have their businesses count upon it, and there's been a whole bunch of companies involved with it, the JVM is highly tuned. It's quite amazing to develop on. It's like another virtual machine. There's lots of really great tooling around debugging it, around developing on it. So we are not writing the Puppet server in Java. I really don't want to slam any Java programmers in the crowd, but we like Clojure a lot better. We picked the JVM because it lets us run Clojure code and Ruby code together. Because I think one of the mistakes a lot of companies have made in the past is they have a successful project, it hits scaling limits, and then they rewrite the whole thing. And it takes a long time, it doesn't have feature parity, they're caught maintaining 2 code bases, but this let us literally, with some pretty small modifications, take the Ruby Puppet server, migrate it to the JVM, and then pick the bits that we wanted to replace with Clojure. I don't think we actually envisage that we'll be replacing everything on the Puppet Master. Ruby's still a really great language for a lot of things, but you'll see that we're trying to move away from forcing you to use Ruby. If you've used external facts in more recent versions of Factor, we can now write facts in any language. You can take any language, so long as it returns JSON, it'll return facts. And this is sort of our longer term direction. We're looking at making the core of Puppet smaller and smaller, so that you can keep running types and providers and functions and all of these things in Ruby if you want. But honestly, we want to make these JSON interfaces between these objects. We don't want to force you to use Ruby. On some platforms, you might be better off writing something in PowerShell. If you're on OS 10, you might want to write it in Objective-C. Different platforms have different languages that are sort of the best for native citizen, and we really want to enable all of those things. One of the features in Puppet 4 that I really like is the templating language. You don't just have to use ERB. We've introduced a Puppet DSL templating language. For me, I used to find the sort of cognitive friction of writing Puppet DSL and then flipping to ERB files was kind of horrible. You're like, I've got to stop prefixing my variables with a $sign. Now I'm writing Ruby, now I'm writing Puppet, now I'm writing Ruby. And it's actually, I think, safer for us. ERB is a full interpreter of the Ruby language. I've seen people abuse templates in horrible, horrible, horrible ways. People who have functions that call out to Pixie servers and rewrite things remotely, like terrible, terrible stuff. We want Puppet to be safer and safer. If you want to have that power, we think we have all the right plug-in points that you can actually do that stuff. But we think a Puppet templating language is much safer for us. It's not Turing complete. It's not something you can actually abuse to the same sort of level. So we still really like Ruby, but we're trying to give you more options And the JVM is definitely not about moving to Java. Sysadmins hate Java. I think they actually more just hate the Java apps that have been forced upon them. But any other questions?
With the Puppet 4 release, there is new packages and the custom prefix you told us about. Is there still an easy way to install Puppet somewhere else, especially without root privileges?
So the question was, is there, now that we've got this standardized installation on the all-in-one agent, is there an easy way to install Puppet somewhere else? So I assume, were you checking out the source or redirecting Ruby lib somewhere and?
Because I'm using Puppet as a user without root privileges, so I have to install it in my own directory. And is there still an easy way to install it?
So not just running Puppet as a user, but having to install it into his home directory. I don't know exactly the details, but all of that's still open source, all of that packaging stuff. And given how much we like to automate things, I'd be really surprised if I looked at the all-in-one packaging scripts and they weren't actually configurable. It seems very unlike our release engineering team to go and hardwire all of those paths inside the packaging system itself. So we can have a look, like this afternoon, I'll go have a look at the Puppet GitHub repository. I'm pretty sure that we've made that pretty configurable. So you could go and produce your own all-in-one packages. It should actually make it easier.
So we can no longer do gem install Puppet?
No, you can still do the Puppet gem in Puppet 4 is absolutely still available.
Yeah. But you're handling all of those dependencies yourself,
On your
either
own.
within gem or outside. I am curious, like, why do you like using Puppet via gems? Just lightweight?
Just because I'm not root.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the answer is he likes installing Puppet via gems because he's not root. I think the all-in-one agent might make it a little bit easier because it means the rest of the dependencies will also be inside your home directory. It's more disk space, but I think disk space is cheap and sysadmin time is expensive.
If I'm not wrong, you released open source Puppet version 4, and in the same time you released the Puppet Enterprise version 3.8. My feeling is that the open source is not ready for production.
Okay, so the question was, if we've just released Puppet 4.0 and Puppet Enterprise 3.8, does that send a signal saying that Puppet 4 is not ready for production? No. So that might send that signal, but that's not our intent at all. We've been running a release candidate series for Puppet 4.0 for a while. This is a really huge change. I can't promise there won't be any issues. It's pretty rare for 4.0 releases of anything to not have issues. For us, the reason we're spending a few months before it's in Puppet Enterprise is because we're trying to build an upgrade path for our commercial customers on Enterprise. And the reason we can do that is because there's lots and lots of ways you can install Puppet open source, and that's good. And we want to have that sort of experimentation be available. Enterprise is a much more standardized platform, so we can build much more, rather than just documenting how to do the upgrade process, we're building tools to automatically help people upgrade from 3.8 to 4.0 Enterprise. So please try Puppet 4 in production. We are not trying to send that signal at all. This is one of the reasons the future parser, which is the biggest change, has been available in 3 for the last year or so as an option. And I think particularly recently, Kara's going to tell me I'm spending enough time, we made a change that I think is going to be really huge for Puppet in general. You can turn the future parser on per environment. So I'm not sure if you all realize this or not, but you don't have to be all in on the future parser. And this is something we're going to try and use environments more and more for people, so that as future features are in development, you can test them within the same Puppet master, but within a different environment. And feel free to come and ask any of us about questions, because I think that's time. I'm around all day, as are all of us. So.
Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you.